Hi there all, and welcome to this panel on gender and climate change. I'm Finn McCarran, and I'm the International Programme Manager for the Conservative Environment Network, which is the forum for conservatives in the UK and around the world who support nature restoration, net zero, and resource security. Now, today we have a wonderful panel on gender and climate change. The UN has issued reports claiming that women are worse affected by climate change than men due to things like who leaves an area when crops fail and engendered impacts of things like climate-fueled conflicts. So this panel really wants to ask the question, is this something we believe? And if so, what can be done about it? And how can you actually convince conservatives to do this sort of thing and to pay attention to this? So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to speak for a couple of minutes, and then we will be able to launch into a Q&A. So I'd like to start with Vicky Ford, who is the Minister for Development, previously the Minister for Africa at the Foreign Office, and also, we're so proud to say, a founding member of the SEN Parliamentary Caucus. So, Vicky.
Yay! It's great to be back at SEN, and thank you for all you've done. How many years ago did we found SEN?
Oh, many.
4 years ago? 4 years ago. It's about time we had a birthday party, I think, really. Yeah. We've done so much over the years. And can I also thank you very much for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted that the Prime Minister has decided to put a voice for development back at the Cabinet table to really look at what's happening in some of the poorest and most challenged parts of the world. And the issue of climate change and the issue of women and girls are absolutely at the top of my priorities. What we know is that women, girls, and most marginalised people are disproportionately impacted by climate change. 80% of people who are displaced by natural disasters are women and children, and such disasters on average kill more women than men. The situation in Pakistan with their floods and the dreadful drought in East Africa are latest examples. I did an online visit to Somalia back in March, April time, and I was introduced to a woman who had recently arrived at a camp for internally displaced people. All her crops had failed. The water hadn't come for 4 rainy seasons. All of her livestock was dead. Everything that she owned had gone. And she had walked for 250 kilometres to get to the camp. That was an 18-day walk. For every one of those 18 days, she carried her baby on her back. And for every one of those 18 days, her 8 children followed her. It is, as I said, women who are disproportionately affected. In fact, I'm leaving conference tonight to go to Ethiopia tomorrow, to go into the Horn of Africa, to shine a light again at that terrible humanitarian disaster called by climate change. However, women and girls are often also critical leaders and agents of change in climate action, including through women's rights organisations. So we took a very inclusive approach during the COP26 presidency, prioritising the advancements of gender equality within our climate action work and driving implementation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has got a bespoke gender work stream within it. Why are women more disproportionately affected when disaster happens? There's a lot of different reasons. Often boys are more likely to receive preferential treatment in rescue efforts. Girls, come to the front. Ladies, come to the front, please. Fill in from the front, if you can. Women and girls often suffer more from the shortage of food, from the lack of privacy, from the lack of washing facilities, bathing, sleeping arrangements. Often in areas where there's been flooding, girls have been discouraged from learning how to swim, so they don't have the same survival skills. And what happens in very vulnerable areas is often you get, sadly, girls being sold into child marriage as well, increased violence. So what are we doing about it? As I said, we took a very feminist stance at COP26. We announced 165 million funding to advance the position of gender equality in climate action. We put some funding in very very specific funding to make sure that women activists could come to COP and have their voices heard. We believe it's really important that women's voices are heard. And we are making sure that, that as we go towards COP27 in Egypt, this voice for women continues to be a key part of the negotiations. I spoke on a couple of events back at the CSW meetings. So the CSW meetings happen in New York every March. It's the Commission on the Status of Women, and that at the UN in March. And we were very much putting this on the agenda again at the UN there. But also, women and girls are absolutely at the heart of our development policy. Okay? The best way to help a developing country stand on its own 2 feet is to educate the girls, empower women, and end violence against women. Okay? If you make sure the girls are educated, the women have the ability to start their own businesses and stand on their own 2 feet, you will unlock growth in a way that you cannot do in any other way. So making sure that we have in all of our humanitarian aid a view on how do we actually also help development start for women to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. So a lot of our humanitarian assistance now is not handing out packets of food. It's handing out cash support payments to the mothers, okay? So that they would be able to use that, for example, to plant their own food, to grow, run a business, and keep things going and start developing an economy as well. In terms of education for girls, we're the leading donor to the organisation called Education Cannot Wait, which works in disaster areas, many of which are climate affected. We absolutely champion the right to 12 years of quality education for every girl. If you educate the girls, the boys will follow. Focusing on the girls means the boys will get in as well. But absolutely championing that right globally. We very, very much focus on also making sure that women have access to the health support they need, especially sexual and reproductive health. Okay, if women do not have control over decisions about, such as when do they want to have children, then everything else leaves them unempowered as well. So making sure, I believe a strong priority within our women and girls policies is that access to health for women. So even in very troubled areas and climate change affected areas. And another incredibly positive thing that we're doing with so many difficult things is the work that we do on science and research. So the UK is a lead in agricultural research, in new crops technology, and really working through our scientists to think about new generations of crops that can be grown in drier areas, in warmer environments, etc. You may have seen just last month a new soybean crop, 20% more productive because it photosynthesized earlier, funded by FCDO research, led by British Sciences, and then often now being rolled out into the field. So trying to think about how do you tackle the food insecurity challenge through more innovation as well. So a key part of my brief as Development Minister is making sure that the funding that we do in R&D helps the challenge, helps to rise to the challenge of climate change, and then helps to get out to those that need it. And so what are we doing to help women with that is looking particularly at how do we fund organisations like the African Development Bank through expanding their balance sheet, big project we've done, guaranteeing them to get loans into smallholders, often women, farmers, in order to be able to take the latest agricultural technology and help feed their families, even despite the climate changes they're seeing. I'm going to stop there.
Brilliant, thank you. And now we move on down the other end of the table, down to Aria, who is the Senior Researcher at the Entrepreneurs Network and the head of the Female Founders Forum.
So I'm going to talk, instead of talking about internationally how we help women in the environment, I want to talk about the UK. So at the Female Founders Forum, we look at high growth founders in the UK who are women. The UK has about 1 in 3 founders who are women, but at the high-end spectrum, this is only about 12%. So we're talking about women who've raised at least $1 million in venture capital. I think one of the main ways that we get out of this climate crisis is by inventing interesting new technologies that can make it cheaper and easier for us to find sustainable solutions instead of sacrificing our quality of life in order to save the environment. And I think what's really interesting is when we look at sectors like AI or life sciences or medical technology and fintech, we see that women are dramatically underrepresented in these sectors. But when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to green technologies and green energy, we find that women are actually more likely to receive venture capital funding, and they're more likely to found and scale businesses in these sectors. And I think that's a really interesting quirk of the British economy. I think there are 3 reasons that I probably think this is the case. One is that women are just more interested in the environment. You poll them, they're more likely to recycle, they're more likely to say that environmental issues are incredibly important to them. So when they're thinking about how they want to tackle issues that they care about and how they want to start businesses, they're more likely to decide to found environmental businesses. But I think another part is the UK government has been very good at providing early stage seed grants to environmental businesses. So Innovate UK grants, you can access them for a whole host of things, but we have a lot that are ring-fenced for environmental businesses, and grants of this nature are one of the only forms of funding that women are more likely to access than men. So we talk to a lot of founders who have university projects or similar, where they receive like about £50,000 of Innovate UK funding and now run very successful businesses that help them get their technology off the ground. And finally, I think the UK has seen a massive change in a lot of what happens in finance with the creation of impact investing in ESG investing. So you see that a lot of the people who are interested in investing in environmental businesses are not only thinking about the environment as a way of making the world better, but they are also thinking about diversity and inclusivity issues, which is another reason why I think we see that a lot of women are very successful green entrepreneurs. So I think there is definitely a degree to which, insofar as we innovate our way out of these problems, women are going to be a key part of that.
Brilliant. Yeah, and moving back down this side of the table, we move on to Steph Spyro, who is the political correspondent and the environment editor for the Daily Express.
Thanks. Really good to be here. I think it's important to say that climate change is a complex and personal issue. It affects economics, politics, health, science. It's a global problem that's felt at a local level. And gender and climate change has being dragged into culture wars. It often is. It's seen as a separate fight. But I hope that people, despite their political affiliations, realize that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. And I know Vicky gave some great examples earlier. But so women and girls are often the ones that go get clean water from rivers, for instance. And if that local water source dries up, they go further. They walk further to find clean water. That means women and girls are out of school for longer and they're more at risk of gender-based violence. So it is integral that addressing gender inequality is at the heart of policy and decision-making. I think maybe why gender is not brought into the conversation around climate change often enough is because I think maybe from a policy perspective, it might be viewed as easier to get people on board if it's a whole. I think also cultural warriors play their part. They get involved and it becomes a delay and distraction tactic from a true action, which is what's needed. The Daily Express has championed climate change through its Green campaign, and the response to that has been incredible. It launched about a year and a half ago, and our readers have really gotten on board. They've shifted how they view and treat the environment. So although I think the gender and climate change is probably less acute in Britain, when we have gone to other parts of the world, like Kenya, like Sri Lanka, the impact of climate change on women is acute. And that has always been reflected in our coverage. But I think people are on board with the climate message more than ever. It helps to have ministers and women in those high-level positions. But I think the drive is there. It's great to hear that there's female entrepreneurs doing their thing too. So I think the will is there now. We just need the action, and women need to be at the heart of policies and at the table making those decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And now we move finally on to Elizabeth Myendo, who is the Disaster Management Lead for Southern and Eastern Africa and the Nairobi Hub representative at Tearfund, who are very kindly joint sponsoring this event today with CAFOD. Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and I'll just follow up to just add on to what Vicky started us on. And my main role here is to just bring to all of you the real picture in terms of what the effects are of climate change, and especially on women and girls. As rightly introduced, my name is Elizabeth, and I come from Kenya. I'm specifically here representing the Horn of Africa. I've been visiting communities in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Uganda recently, just with the focus of this current drought that we're experiencing right now in Horn of Africa. I know most of you are just maybe reflecting back and saying, oh, but we've always heard about hunger crisis in East Africa or Horn of Africa. I'll tell you, over the last 10, 12 years, there's a lot of investment that has gone into place. And drought has been a cyclone. We've had cyclic droughts that we've been able to manage. But right now, what we're experiencing is something that I personally, I've been in the humanitarian sector for the last 14 years. I've been able to respond to 3 different drought disasters. But what we're experiencing right now, it's the worst kind of drought that we've ever seen. We've had 4 years of failed rainy seasons. And most of the communities that I'm representing and I'm speaking of here, they're solely dependent on agriculture and pastoralism. So you can imagine 4 years of no rainfall, what happens. And I'll start off with just giving an example of one of the women that I met in northern part of Kenya, specifically in Turkana. Her name is Eunice. Eunice is a mother of 4, and unfortunately, Eunice's sister passed on, and she had to take in her 4 sisters' 4 children. So Eunice feeds 8 children in her house. Eunice, together with our community, they had come up with a plan of a solar irrigated farms where they could depend on actually, instead of just depending on rain-fed agriculture, they could also depend on the solar irrigated farms. But because of the 4 years of failed rainy seasons, the water tables have really gone low, and the solar pumps cannot pump any water. So they've had no harvest at all. So this means Eunice and her 8 children, they have nothing to feed. And she looks at them. When I was talking to her, she was just looking at the little ones and saying the older children had to be pulled out of school, both boys and girls, to go and scavenge in the nearest towns and just look for wild fruits and bring for the younger children for them to feed so that at least they have something to eat. In Ethiopia, I met a woman called Tigiste. Tigiste is a young mother. She's just 23 years old, and she has 3 children. And Tigiste got married at a very young age because of also the issue to do with drought, and she thought it was just relieving stress from her family. But unfortunately, her husband has lost all the headstock that he had. He's seen his livestock die because over the years, there's been no pasture generating, and he's been traveling miles and kilometers in search of pasture. And this has also generated a lot of conflict between other tribes that are also fighting for that pasture. He's lost all his livestock. Tigiste feeds her children on tons. I'm talking about children below, the eldest child is 8 years old. The youngest was 1 year old. And while I watched Tigiste breastfeeding this little boy, I was really sad for him because he was so malnourished, and so was Tigiste. So the impact of this current drought, especially on women and children, is really, really devastating. And communities such as Tigiste's and Eunice's are experiencing it because they had put mechanisms in place to actually tackle the drought. But because of the climate change that we are actually experiencing in East Africa, we are seeing a drought that we've never seen before. So women are often responsible for feeding and also for scavenging for food for their families. And because of this stress, most of them are actually having to go long distances in search of water or in search of this food. And with that, they're experiencing a lot of sexual-based violence. And some of them have even gone to the extent of pulling their little girls out of school, or even the girls themselves volunteering to drop out of school with the thought that if they get married, they'll actually be able to fetch some dowry that will push their family forward. So we are seeing a lot of young marriages also happening, especially in northern Kenya, in southern Ethiopia, and northern Uganda. And all this is because these communities are actually experiencing this worst drought. So my prayer and plead is that we need to act today. We need to just support the humanitarian support that is actually happening. I'm glad to hear, Vicky, you'll be going to Ethiopia next week.
This week, tomorrow.
This week, tomorrow. So you'll be able to actually see what I'm just talking about here. And it's about time we just start advocating more for the climate finances that we've been speaking about, that we have all pledged to, and targeting the local communities and local responders, and more specifically, the women. The women in Africa and the women in these communities are very resilient. And if we target them rightly, they'll be able to support us through, they'll be able to pull themselves and pull their communities through this period and the future in terms of what they are facing. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. I think now we'd like to move on to some questions from the audience. We want to get as many in as possible, so make sure they are short and to the point, and they include an aspect of gender and an aspect of climate change. And we're going to take them bachelors of 3 to save our poor runner. So does anyone have a question?
That's easy.
Okay, so why don't I start with potentially more of a narrative question. How do you frame the claim that women are worse affected by climate change to Conservatives without making it sound anathema to their political beliefs? Does anyone want to come in on that? Sure.
I don't really think it's a very helpful framing. I think my immediate gut reaction to it is that true, for one? It sounds like it's the kind of statement that people, like, I think the left definitely has a culture of making every issue about every issue. Like, if you'd ever seen the Stop Brexit protests, you also always had the socialists, the general strike, and like all of the different issues came together. And it sounds to me a little bit like it's one of those things. I'm not sure whether or not the statement is true either, just because, like, you know, you look at places like South Sudan where the conflict is I wouldn't want to reduce the complexity of it, but the environment is clearly part of what's going on there. And while it is true that women are obviously experiencing a lot of violence, it is also true that the men are like getting killed. So it is not clear to me that that statement is necessarily true when people are fleeing their homes as well. That is also a very, very dangerous thing that these men are doing. So it sounds instinctively to me like I would react against it. And I don't think who is the world's top victim is like a particularly useful framing for any of the environmental issues, because they're clearly so devastating without needing to say, and also there's a diversity problem. Like, people are dying. You don't need to say, and these people are women, to make it a compelling problem.
That's very interesting.
Completely sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. I think first of all you have to realise that every country is different. So let's not generalise every country. But we do know, as I said at the beginning, that where you have natural disasters, 80% of the people who are displaced are women and children. And it tends to be often that the woman is the carer for the children. Okay. And when I look over the places that are sort of flashing red on the humanitarian need map, and by the way, there's 50 million people on the brink of famine in 46 different countries across the world. We've never seen needs like this, not in decades. The places that are flashing red often are climate and conflict. But where you look at where the conflict's happening, so for example, in the Horn of Africa, we need to worry about the dreadful, dreadful drought that Elizabeth spoke about so beautifully, but we also need to worry about the awful conflicts that are happening in Tigray, where the reports of the sexual violence and violence against women and rape being used as a weapon of war, and the impact on women. Yes, men have died, but women have also suffered hideous violence. As I said, there are also the child marriage issues, which Elizabeth spoke about very beautifully. We hear that again and again sadly, in so many different parts of the world. And, it sounds, marriage is meant to be such a loving phrase. It's meant to sum up this beautiful picture of, happiness and happy ever after. Child marriage is not happy ever after. I recently heard from a young woman, a 15-year-old in Nigeria, who spoke about her best friend from primary school, who was such a keen learner, desperate to learn, but northern Nigeria, so full of conflict, didn't have the parental support to carry on learning, and this young girl was entered into a child marriage at the age of 11, She got pregnant at the age of 12 and she died in childbirth. You know, a 12-year-old's body is not ready to have babies, and yet it happens again and again and again. So tackling child marriage, tackling the violence. So there's different ways that women are affected, but they are disproportionately affected. When you look at the effect of lack of food, I was in northern Kenya in January, because we know that when you get in early in some of these crises, we can see the crisis coming. If you can get some of the funding in early, who do we target? We target those that the lack of food is going to hit most. Who is it going to hit most and worst? It's the pregnant mum and the breastfeeding mum and the really young child. So when we look at how we are spending our humanitarian aid, often it's going straight into making sure there's decent food for that group. Women are affected more, and we need to recognise that. Yeah. Disabled people as well, LGBT people as well, will find themselves often in these situations being penalised. But it's the most marginal person is often a woman.
Okay, now we've got some questions. I see people have come along. So I just want to come back on that quickly. So obviously you very much believe in the idea that women are much more affected by climate change. But how do you counter Aria's the characterization that it feels like who's the worst off victim narrative, and how do you tackle the fact that some people don't necessarily agree with the intersectional nature of tackling things like international development?
So the point is, if you look at something like educating girls, which we know is one of the key ways you can help build economic strength and resilience, the reason you focus on educating the girl is because she's got the one who's got the biggest barriers to come to school, okay? She's the one who the parents may think, we can't afford to educate both of you, so we will, you know, you're just going to have babies, so we'll educate the son. She's the one who possibly is most at risk of violence on the way into school. She's the one who finds that she can't go to school when she's got her period because there's no washing facilities. So if we target the most vulnerable woman, sorry to single you out, ma'am, in the front row rather than the lady that's sitting beside you, it means if we address all the girls' issues, we're also addressing the issues that the boys have, okay? So that's why we will focus on the most marginalised.
Okay. Would you like to
and just to add on to what Vicky has just said, if you focus on the woman, most of the time, the men will always leave. Like what you're experiencing right now in Horn of Africa, most men actually left with their livestock, and some of them were even killed, or they just disappeared or have never come back. And it's because of the shame that they cannot take care of their families. That's why they're not coming back, or they've actually moved to other cities and are not coming back to support. But the women, when the women move, they'll always move with their children. They'll never leave their children behind. When the young girls get married, they get married to most likely older men with the hope that those older men will give them a better life, which is never the case. And at the end of the day, you see also the young girls being left behind by these older men. So that's why the vulnerability in terms of men and women, it's more on the women. And you see it and you feel it, and it's just right there because they don't even have the power to move. The men will sometimes have a few coins on their pockets. The women will not have that. So they'll just stay there and just hope for the best, yeah.
Okay, now let's go to questions. So let's take the one directly behind you, Katie, and then across the aisle, and then further back.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Marianne, I'm from the Women's Budget Group. I very much agree with what Vicky was saying about the impact of climate change on women. But I think it's also important when we're thinking about tackling climate change to think in terms of the fact that men and women are differently situated and have different needs affect what they need. If, for example, you're trying to get people to use their cars less and use public transport more, you need public transport that recognises the fact that women may be taking their children to school before they go to work, for example. Our public transport systems tend to be designed from getting people from the outside of cities and towns into the middle in the morning and back out in the evening. They're not very good for the sort of trip chaining that women do, which is, you know, taking your kids to school, then going to work, then coming back via the supermarket to pick up food, maybe popping in to see your mum. So for me, the reason why you need to have that kind of gendered approach is to actually make sure that your policy works in the way that you intend it. If you want to get people out of their cars and onto public transport, you need to think about a public transport system that meets the needs of both women and men, and those needs are different because women do the majority of care work.
Okay, brilliant. And then across the aisle.
Hi, I'm Grace from Quakers in Britain. Given that climate change is affecting the most marginalised right now, isn't it even more important that the UK pledges finance for loss and damage and encourages other countries to do the same?
Okay, brilliant. And then I'll just give Katie a chance to catch up. And then towards the back wasn't my question.
Hi, Tim Ingram from WaterAid. So pleased that water and climate is being linked in this. What I'm really interested in is, from the panel's perspective, we've highlighted that women and girls are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. How do we ensure that they are a fundamental part of the solutions?
Okay, brilliant. So that's three very good questions there. How do we deal with kind of different needs, and how can we do a gendered approach? What do we think of loss and damage? And then, and then one we literally just heard. So sorry, I've completely forgotten already, but hopefully our speakers haven't. Steph, do you want to come in on any of these?
I'll start off. So I think to the first question, we need to make sure that women are at the table when making decisions, and this is at a grassroots level, a national level, and an international level, because women are impacted by climate change, so they need to be part of the solution. And I don't think there are enough women at the table right now, so that comes down to policy, and I think women are speaking out, so the voices are there. I think they just need to march to the door and make sure that they're at the table. I think last year, to the second question, I think the UK pledged 165 million at COP26 towards. Are you shaking your head? Is that? The UK hasn't pledged any finance for loss and damage specifically. Okay, so I think that the government needs to take some action there and step up. I don't know if maybe for some reason it's seen as a faraway issue, but the unfortunate thing is that developed countries have contributed the most to climate change, and it is the developing nations that need loss and damage and the climate financing, and they'll benefit the most from that. So maybe Vicky wants to come in there.
Keep going down the table and I'll...
Okay. Well, do we have anything to add? Or maybe about female solutions to climate change?
Yeah, okay. So I firstly just want to quickly say I don't disagree with taking a gendered approach solutions-wise. I suspect on the solutions I probably agree very much with the rest of the panel. It is simply a narrative claim that I was making about how true I think the statement is and whether or not I think it's helpful for advancing aims. Okay. So on women being part of the solution, I do think that we should really take advantage of the fact that women care a lot more about the environment than men. I think there's a really quite an interesting trend actually, which you can see with the evolution of a lot of LGBT and feminist issues, and you can see this with even the growth of Christianity, where it seems to be the case that if in one generation women disproportionately believe something, in the next generation that becomes a much more mainstream belief. So the fact that women care a lot more about the environment now means, I think, and we can already see this trend, I think is a very good predictive factor that we're going to see younger and younger people caring more and more about the environment as time goes on. So I think it's really helpful that women care about it, and women are more likely to be looking for solutions.
Brilliant. And perhaps, Elizabeth, you could speak to the loss and damage point and the climate finance.
On the climate finance, I think one of the key things we could do is ensure that the commitments and the prioritizations we are making, as much as we are targeting maybe the big bodies, the UNs and all, we are intentionally also focusing on supporting local partners and local NGOs. And that locality will make sure that the local and the context that is in place is actually considered in some of these solutions. And it's also ensuring that climate reaches those, the climate finances that we are committing it reaches those who need it the most, and especially financing women activities. And I was very happy to hear in Vicky's introduction that some of the commitments that we've made, they're specifically going to target like women groups and making sure that the education aspect, the health aspect, and also the just the vocational studies and all this are taken into consideration in terms of the sustainable solutions we're coming up with, so that the women themselves are also uplifted. And if I was married off at the age of 15, I have to make sure that my girl or my daughter does not do the same, or my niece and my nephew, so that we break this cycle of early marriages. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And Vicky?
So first of all, to Tim's question, and by the way, thank you very much to everything that WaterAid does. It's so important that people have access to clean water, and especially in health facilities. Where are you, Tim? Oh, there you are. You can't hide the back. They're really important. And tragically, so much the world is not getting that, as Tim reminded me yesterday. But it's making sure that women's rights organisations do have a voice, and women are consulted in everything that's going on. And often, as I said, every country is different, and often it's local women's organisations that play such a role. I try and meet women's organisations on all of my visits. I've visited 15 different African countries in the past 12 months. And often they're not only telling you what the grassroots are saying, but they're also giving you some of the solutions and what they would like to see done. So it's absolutely making sure that they are involved. In terms of climate change financing, now obviously the UK has pledged a world-leading £11.6 billion for climate change. Absolute massive amount of money for climate change. Needs to make sure that that is well spent in a number of different ways. It will increase ambition on inclusion and on gender equality, which is part of that. There's a couple of projects that are actually already up and running. The £25 million project, Better Assistance in Crisis, called BASIC, and the 19 million gender-responsive social protection programmes. They're strengthening disaster preparedness and response. That is including greater coordination between climate, social protection, humanitarian and gender action, and is also in many areas supporting adaptation as well. In Somalia, we have been working on putting in boreholes and water facilities for the past number of years. The issue is there's just not enough. There are more than there were in the last drought, but we've been doing this for a number of years in different countries as well. And I know that this will be a big topic of conversation, and I know that the COP president is in my ear, but we absolutely we hear that, but we need to make sure that the 11.6 is doing a lot of good work. I used part of it to fund that African Development Bank expansion to help them get in the better innovative crops as well. So, it's a bit of it sometimes I feel is that we're missing some of the other things that we do in this space, in that discussion. And to the conversation about transport for women, okay? And in the UK, one of the things I'm really pleased that the Prime Minister is putting right up the agenda in her growth plan is looking at childcare, okay? Look, affordable childcare, more flexible childcare. She was Children's Minister way back in her first ministerial job. I was Children's Minister a couple of years ago. Childcare in this country is very, very, very expensive and often very inflexible. The government pours tons and tons of money into it, but it's not necessarily being as flexible and adaptable for the parents as it could be. So I'm really glad that she's put that right in the forefront of her growth plan.
Brilliant. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yes, right down at the front. Let's go.
So I came here, actually I didn't know about this Catholic organization. Actually I like it. I am Catholic myself. About climate change, I think it has to be taken much more serious when it is now. That temporary moratorium is, like Liz now says, is very good. I supported it from formulating this idea. But it is, should be, I think, as short as possible. and after we have to go to that net zero direction. As that all that thing it hurts these countries which are developing countries, and it is like for this discussion, how I understood it hurts actually children most, well, women and children, but that is women just because it is in developing countries. Like here, well, women, men is about equality. Out there is women and children very much together. It goes. And that's actually it is about children. That hurts children. So it is quite a horrible topic, isn't it? And so taking more serious also is about all that thing is taking together for all the world, because like becomes competing. One countries wants to go to that net zero, others no. You have to be one standard for everything, for all countries. Yeah. And could you something to tell something more, to clarify that, to develop that topic further?
Okay, so talking about net zero, and actually related to that, I kind of think, is it worth us maybe just going for, just trying to go for mitigating climate change, and then hoping that because gender is so closely tied up in it in certain countries, that gender equality will improve as a result? That will be, like, that's one of the questions that I've been quite interested in. Are there any more questions from the audience so we can take them as a batch? There's another one right at the back. Sorry to make you walk.
Sorry, thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation. My name is Richard Blunt. I'm a comms professional for APCO Worldwide, but in my spare time, I am a London grassroots coordinator for an international development charity called Results UK. My question actually for the Minister is actually in relation to the famine.
I'm not going to answer questions if you're sitting right at the back.
Sorry.
Come up the front and sit with everybody else.
I certainly can do.
Come on, come on, there's a place here.
If you'd like to come up.
But so my
Come and
question,
let us see you.
I will scooch forward. So my question is actually about the war in Ukraine at the moment, and the fact that the shipments of grain leaving Ukraine are being cancelled and paused by the Russian government, and that the fact that Ukraine supplies 40% of the World Food Programme's grain, and given climate change, given the droughts in a lot of countries at the moment, and the lack of food supplies, then this additional burden of no food being able to go through those transport and logistics supply chains at the moment is going to cause potentially one of the worst famines we've seen for a very, very long time. So my question really is about what the global community can do about it now, and the preparations which need to take place for next year and the years after, when this problem might become most prevalent. Thank you very much.
Okay, brill. Yeah, so why don't we take some of those? So is it worth just mitigating and hoping gender equality benefits come as a result? And what are we going to do about food security? Minister, as he moved forward, would you mind answering?
So, first of all, on that we should take climate change more seriously, can I just tell you that we do take climate change very, very seriously, okay? I am a conservative, and conservation is in my name. That is what people in the Conservative Environment Network believe, okay? I am very proud that it was a Conservative government in the UK that was the first major economy to legislate for net zero. Okay? I was one of the 10 members of Parliament who put my name to the first bill to propose that brought that then through our legislation. Okay? I am enormously proud that we chaired COP26 in Glasgow that brought the world together. It was a first priority of our now Prime Minister when she became Foreign Secretary, was to make sure that that conference happened. Despite COVID, despite the global lockdowns, that the world needed to come together for COP26. Okay? It's a real struggle, but COP26 is the only hope that we have that we can keep 1.5 alive, right? So we have to do that, okay? In terms of what are we doing post-COP, and this maybe goes back into the lady's question earlier when she was asking about adaptation funds. I'm very focused on delivering the practical efforts of some of what was promised at COP. So in particular, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships to help decarbonise, in particular, South Africa. South Africa is the most carbon-generating electricity network in the world. It's brown coal, it's ancient, the electricity network doesn't work. You have these load-shedding blackouts all the time. But the UK promised to lead the international funding for the Just Energy Transition. It's been the top of my to-do list for the past years, making sure that it stays on track. It's got to be led by the South Africans. It's their project, but making sure that we keep the support for them to deliver those projects. We need to make sure that we support developing economies to transform in a just way in their transitions. In terms of Ukraine and getting the grain out of Ukraine, Putin is not only causing this awful, awful war to the people in Ukraine, but he is also using food and fuel as a weapon of war to the rest of the world, okay? And blockading the grain getting out of Ukraine is an absolute strategy, was an absolute strategy by Putin to cause that food price shock, okay? Thanks to a huge amount of work, the grain started flowing again out of Ukrainian ports. Not at huge speed, but I believe in August it was 10 times more grain came out of Ukraine than had happened in May, June time, okay? Keeping those ports open relies on the Russians being prepared to keep that, as it were, port ceasefire going, okay? The Turks also played a very important role in negotiating that. Liz Truss was in Turkey helping to negotiate that just a few days before it was announced. We from the UK have also provided a huge amount of technical support to the Ukrainians, for example, on how you can try to use rail routes as well as sea routes to get grain out. It's very difficult because the Ukrainian railway gauge is a different, what are they called? Gauge sizes, yeah. I did used to run model trains with my sons and daughters at some point, but so they don't go across the border very easily, but we've done lots of technical work also on rebuilding some of the infrastructure. I think we always think that Network Rail take an awful lot of time to mend railway trains in the UK, but apparently they're really, really, really great at helping mending railway trains where they've suffered bomb damage and other damage in Ukraine. So we've been doing lots and lots of work behind the scenes to help get that grain out. It remains a really big issue, and it will continue to be an absolute focus. What Ukraine wants to do is make sure that they don't need to just rely on having the coming through the sea routes. They want to be able to, over time, be able to make sure there were land routes. There were some reports yesterday that this is what I was looking for on my phone, a Russian-run smuggling operation that's stealing Ukrainian grain, worth over $500 million. One of the other things that we've been doing, back to my geeky stuff about science and technology, is we've been running a project that you can like DNA sample where the grain comes from. It's really clever, actually. They're really, really clever. So we've been looking at where, with some partner countries, grain that's appearing in other parts of the world and being able to track down to say, does that come from Ukraine? So we're getting the evidence as well. Lots and lots of work happening behind the scenes on the grain.
Oh, very cool. Does anyone else want to come in on any of the mitigation or food security points? No?
Right, can I strongly recommend that those of you who are interested in foreign policy are in the hall from about 5 o'clock this afternoon, please. It will be some very important speakers.
I see. Do we have any more audience questions?
Oh, one more.
Okay, we've got one over there.
It's just a follow-up kind of on what you were talking about East Africa while we have Steph here. Sorry, I'm Lydia, I'm from Christian Aid. I just want to ask, how can we leverage the media more to bring attention?
Yeah. So let me tell you what we are doing in East Africa, okay? Because the media are absolutely not reporting this, okay? And I wish they would, okay? I wish they would, because the situation in the Horn of Africa is the worst humanitarian situation in the world. I can give you the numbers. I think it's over 40 million people affected. And then that's not only that it hasn't rained for 4 rainy seasons.
4 years.
4 years. But it's also that you've had weird floods in South Sudan as well. And then, so half of the people in Somalia are in need of humanitarian aid at the moment, okay? The latest report out of the UN has said that famine will be declared, okay? And we know that most people die before the famine's declared, okay? And so action is urgently needed. You've got also difficult conflict situations. So you've got in Tigray, the war in Tigray, where the number of times I have called on the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayans to go back to the ceasefire. They had 5 months of ceasefire, and they've now started, sadly, violence again. The Eritreans coming in from the north. Eritrea needs to go back within their borders, but this is all making it more difficult to get the aid through. And of course, in parts of northern Kenya, Somalia, you've got Al-Shabaab as well, which is also not helping. What has the UK done? Well, first of all, we know that if you act early, you can help save lives, which is why we announced our first amount of money back in January, particularly projects like I mentioned, helping the pregnant mothers, lactating mothers, small children, very targeted, helping through the social funding payments to get money to people who are facing humanitarian needs. We will put £156 million into humanitarian aid in East Africa this year, okay? I've been targeting that at the most vulnerable, but that is not nearly enough, okay? So then the question is, how do we leverage in other funding sources as well? And how do we make sure that, where possible, the funding goes to those who need it most? Back in May time, I think, you need to get the date from me, we worked with the UN on a round table that brought in another $400 million, including money from people who had not been traditional donors into the area. But so, for example, the Qataris have been very helpful. They've been putting money, and then we've been, and that's gone through some of the programs we run, so we know it gets to the people on the ground. The World Bank agreed a package of $170 billion back in April, but it wasn't getting out. That money is to go and help those affected by the impact of food and fuel prices from Ukraine and developing countries. It wasn't getting out, so I wrote to the head of the World Bank. That money has now started being dispersed. UN OCHA as well, we've got them now dispersing funds as well. There is still a huge need from other non-traditional partners, and that is what we keep trying to shuffle more funding in. When the border is open between northern Kenya and Somalia, I've been told it makes the aid flowing much more easily. Is that right? And then that significantly reduces the costs. So trying to tackle some of the insecurity sides as well as the humanitarian sides is a key priority.
That's brilliant.
Sorry, there you go. Thank you for asking us.
So that's quite a list. Steph, do you want to come in on how the media can leverage?
So later this week, there is actually an Express reporter heading to East Africa to cover what we're talking about. So it's definitely on the Express's agenda, but I absolutely agree that generally media can and should do more. So I promise to champion it, definitely in the Express.
And Steph, can you make sure, please, that when your journalist writes about this, it gives me a chance to explain what we have been doing with British taxpayers' money?
Sure,
Okay.
we can get
So that people know what we've been doing and the difference it makes, okay? because I think it's really important that people know that. Otherwise, people don't understand. They don't think their money and their funding is making really big differences. You know, it's important, other than the moral need to support people in such need, it impacts our own safety and security back at home, where you've got insecurity in areas like the Horn of Africa. We know that can lead to insecurity along the whole of our trading routes, and we know it can lead to more small boat migration as well back here. So it, you know, important.
I'll be
Thank you, my dear. Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes left. So Elizabeth, do
And
you want
just to add on to that is just the importance of bringing also the effects of Russian invasion into Ukraine, the effects that it's also having on the situation. Because right now, even the resources that we as humanitarian aid workers, we are receiving to respond to this crisis, they're not enough because the number of people that we have to target are quite a lot. We are talking about 4 years, again, 4 years of failed rain season. So the geographical focus is huge, the needs are huge, and the number of people who are in need are very high. And it's becoming more difficult because also the cost of food is also being felt in Africa as well as or the rest of the world, which is also an issue that the reporter could also look into in terms of how is that also affecting the humanitarian response that is going on. Thank you.
Absolutely. So that is quite a to-do list for Steph. We've only got a few more minutes left, so I think we're going to go across the panel and just do 1 minute final closing remarks, really strictly 1 minute, because we've got a really tight turnaround. So Aria, would you like to come in for one final minute?
Yeah, I'll be brief with that then. I think one of the most important things that the UK government is doing when it comes to climate change is thinking about how we can make sure that we keep inventing new things. I think this is our big advantage. I think our aid spending is very, very important, and I'm be very excited to see a lot of it come back. But the most important thing, the thing that the UK is very good at, is invention and science and technology. And I think that the fact that we have significant amounts of Innovate UK funding and the new Aria Research and Development Agency and the investment that we put into our universities, that's really how we're going to tackle climate change over the next century. And I really hope that we think very carefully about how we are funding these different groups and how we are using our resources.
Brilliant. Elizabeth, one final minute.
Just to appreciate the support and the help that we're getting from the UK government. We are very grateful. And to just emphasize the need to put this support, especially to local responders and local organizations, and a great focus on women, because the women will never leave. They will always be there. And to see that development and sustainability on years and years to come, we need to invest more in women. Thank you.
Brilliant. Steph?
And I'm going to pledge to make sure that we continue highlighting women in the Express. It's such an important issue. We play a huge, huge role in shaping the public's opinion on climate change. So I have a responsibility to make sure that the public Express readers are aware. So it'd be great to get Vicky to write for us. And anyone here, if you ever want to talk to Express or get involved and help me champion women and gender in climate, then I welcome that.
That's very lovely. And finally, the last word to the Minister.
Conflict, climate change, the aftermath of COVID have had devastating impacts on the poorest countries of the world. They have sent us back decades. We can do a lot to tackle this. Empowering, educating, and ending violence against women is a key part of how we support these countries. You're absolutely right that we also need to keep innovating for the future, which is a UK leadership area, in order to find new solutions as well. But what we also need to do is make sure that we keep the eye of the world on these incredibly vulnerable areas. Okay? That's why we need the media to do as much as they can as well. And please keep telling people about the good work that we do in this area and why that work is important to our own security and stability at home too, because that helps me to win discussions about funding and financing.
Thank you so much to all of our panellists. Thank you so much to all of you for listening. Our next event will be in literally 15 minutes, and it will be going nuclear with the Bay Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg, so do stick around for that.